Thank you, and hello everybody, and to those who are listening online. I wonder, did you think about making your will when you were in your early 20s? Probably not. If I think back to that time, I cannot think of anything that I valued, that I had, that would be of value to anybody. And what little savings I might have had would have just gone to my next of kin. My son is in the Navy. It was a bit of a shock at the time, not coming from a military family. My father served in the war, but was not a professional soldier. So when my husband and I went to Dartmouth on a family welcome day, he quite brightly announced, "I made my will today." Well, that cheered me up no end. But apparently that is something that is now mandatory to do. I did not make my will in my 20s, in my youth, because I did not conceive that death might be around the corner. For the men, knowing that they were going to war, it was a different matter entirely. In 2013, a project was set up to commemorate the centenary of the First World War by Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service, HMCTS. Its aim was to digitise just under nearly 278,000 wills covering the period 1860 to 1986 of soldiers. Over 80% of those were wills from the First World War, nearly 230,000. David Tattersfield, who was a trustee of the Western Front Association, was a consultant on this project, and much of the information in the next few slides comes from his work. So we see here, every soldier had to complete a will before they headed to the front line so that their estate could be dealt with if they lost their lives. They carried a copy with them. Many used the will to write letters to their loved ones, expressing their feelings. So we see here, in the event of my death, I leave all of my effects to the lady he names here, who happened to be his mother. This is not a Norfolk will, by the way. But this wasn't entirely true. So let's look, first of all, at the types of wills that were processed by the War Office. Soldiers carried their army paybook, AB 64, at all times unless they were involved in a trench raid. At the back of the book was a blank page to allow the soldier to make a will along with instructions. As it was not witnessed, it was categorized as an informal will under the Wills Act of 1837. But it did have to be signed for it to be legal. Then if the soldier was killed, where possible, the will would be extracted from the deceased's paybook, and it would be sent back to the War Office in the UK. A further declaration stating the legality of the will was then made in the War Office, and most military wills are in this category. So we see here, War Office, the record number, their name, regiment and rank, where they died, and their date of death. Wills classified as formal wills were those signed by two witnesses. They might be fellow soldiers or officers. These used Army Form B243 if there was only one beneficiary, and Forms B244, W3297 for more than one beneficiary. The latter form was not very common. These formal wills would not be part of the soldier's paybook, and they would not routinely be carried by the soldier. And that is the form they would need to fill in. The research into military wills show a survival rate of only 60%. Explanations for this include the likelihood that many soldiers did not even make a will despite being urged to do so, or their paybook may not have been recovered from their bodies. I consulted the World War I historian Neil Story on this matter, and his response was that many soldiers deliberately left the page blank because they felt it would jinx them and lead to their death. In such cases, a blank page, the War Office would use the details of next of kin on the enlistment papers to deal with the soldier's estate. The other types of military wills are non-cupative wills, missing wills, and testamentary wish letters. Non-cupative will is a will that is given verbally. So a soldier might say in his last moments of life, please make sure my mother gets everything, that sort of thing. If a will was missing, the War Office accepted statements from a soldier's family regarding information the soldier may have stated verbally concerning his last wishes. They also accepted such statements from his family if they had seen the missing will. For example, the soldier may have shown it to the family before leaving for the front. Testamentary wish letters from soldiers writing home and expressing some form of final wish could also be accepted instead of a will. This is the only example of a testamentary wish letter out of the 228 wills found so far in the Norfolk Record Office that I'm going to be speaking about today. It's unusual in that we can see from James's letter that he had written a will, but we also see that probate was granted on the basis of this letter and the information contained in it. James was born in Weston-super-Mare, but he was living in Canada when he enlisted in Winnipeg in March 1916. He came over to England in October that year, and he married Edith in 1917. James died of shrapnel wounds to the head in April 1918 and is buried in Vimy Communal Cemetery in France. He's also on the Canadian Virtual War Memorial. His wife Edith was still a widow in 1921, back living with her parents. She had 2 children then, both born long after James's death. The Norwich Probate Court proved wills and granted probate. Copies of these wills were bound in volumes, 3 for each year. You may look at some of the volumes at the end of the talk. Of nearly 6,000 wills spanning the war period and beyond, only 228 were what I define as battlefield wills. This represents less than 2% of the estimated 15,000 Norfolk men who died in the war. I call them battlefield wills because the testator identifies themselves as being in military service. And then their deaths are recognised by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Their definition being deaths that occurred between the 4th of August 1914 and the 31st of August 1921. So I started with the volume at the outbreak of the First World War, and I ended with the last volume of 1922. This allowed me to use the Commonwealth War Grave definition for a military death, but also allowed time for the administration process of the probate court to work its wheels. This was quite a wise move, as it turned out, because the last will to be proved in the 1922 volume was of a gentleman called James Laws, who had actually died 4 years earlier. And it's the only example of a testamentary wish letter that we have. These 228 wills fall into 2 categories, formal and informal. The formal wills signed by 2 witnesses, just like any civilian will, but it is clear from reading them that they are military wills. Here we see the will of Claude Victor Emerson and witnessed by 2 men from the same Army Cyclist Corps, the King's Liverpool Regiment. These wills were often made before being posted overseas. Claude was killed in action on the 16th of October 1917. He was 30. He left a wife and 3 children. Research so far shows that his 2 witnesses survived. Informal wills had no witnesses, and so they needed an affidavit to confirm the soldier had written it. Of the 228 wills found, 190 had these affidavits, that's 83%. The crucial wording making the will legal is while a soldier in actual military service. what you see highlighted on the screen. So a soldier could be killed while on leave, but the will is still legal. It then becomes a battlefield will because his death is commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So we see Section 11 of the Wills Act provided for those in actual military service to be able to make a will without any formality. It would not matter whether a death was in service or not. It was the fact of making the will in service which is significant. And then the Will, Soldier and Sailors Act of 1918 clarified and extended the Wills Act of 1837. Section 1 confirms a soldier on active service or sailor at sea can and always could have made that it is of retrospective effect a valid privileged will. The earliest death to be proved at the Norwich Probate Court occurred on the 12th of March 1915. This graph looks at the volumes in turn. So we start with 1914, the first volume, C, which would be the December volume. It goes from August through to December. And then we have 3 volumes working all our way along. We have 3 volumes for each year. So the earliest death was proved on the 12th of March 1915 and proved 8 months later in the 3rd volume of that year. So that's why at the beginning of the graph we have 3 zeros. The last death was on the 26th of March 1921 and was proved 6 months later. And the latest was in October 1922, 4 years after the soldier's death. So where did I start? Well, obviously I started with the will and the information that it gave me. So here's a really good example. There are varying degrees of information in each will, and this is one of the simplest that we have. So we can see it was written on the 21st of December 1916. The name is W. Weston. We have an address of Spa Common at North Walsham. His mother is a widow. We know that from reading the comments at the bottom of the will when the will is proved. He has a sister called Virtue. He's a private in the Middlesex Regiment. In the left-hand column, we have the affidavit of handwriting, and the will, again, at the bottom, it was proved on the 10th of January, 1918. So that is the starting point. So what else can we find out? Firstly, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission confirms it's a military death, and it gives additional information such as where the death is commemorated. Genealogy sites then build up a much more detailed picture with a little bit of Googling added into the mix. So what picture do we have of him now? So he was called William, and he was born in 1883 in North Walsham. His parents were James and Hannah. He also had a brother, John. We have his service number, his regiment, the actual date of his death, where he is commemorated, the Lissenhoek Military Cemetery in Belgium, and his probate, his estate, £79, 9 shillings and 2pence, which I don't think I need to explain to the audience today. And that's worth around £4,700 in today's money. So I took all the data of my 228 soldiers and entered it onto a spreadsheet. So I'm going to go across the column headings for you. These volumes at the Record Office, their preface is PRDR2 stroke. And then you have the volume numbers, 174, 175, 179, all the various volumes that they have been found. The next column along, did they have an affidavit to show it was a military will? Yes or no? Then we have the will number. So this is that hopefully if somebody is looking up this on the search catalogue, they're able to find a particular person. We have their surname, we have their first name. We have the year they were born, the year they died, with the actual dates. The age they died. It's not always a straightforward subtraction, depending on the month that they were born in and the month they died. Where they were from. Here we see all Norfolk and Norwich addresses. Then their rank, their service number if they had one, their regiment, and their battalion, if that information is given. Then the spreadsheet continues. Some of our soldiers, by the time, sadly, that they died, were of a different rank. They had a different service number. They may have been with a different regiment, different battalion. And then did they have an inscription? Obviously, if they were able to be buried, there was a headstone, had the family chosen to have an inscription. Where they are commemorated. WS, did they have a wife or did they have a sweetheart? Because if they did, they are usually mentioned in their will. And then where were those wives and sweethearts in 1921? We'll look at that in more detail later. Were they widowed, single, had they remarried, etc.? The next two columns were for my own personal benefit. Was it a very simple will? The ones that I think are the most poignant in many ways. Did they have a really good story to tell? You can find out more information about some than others. Cause of death, if it was given, and what service they were in. The spreadsheets are available in the documents room, so you are able to look at all the names of all of the men if you wish to at the end of the talk. And then I investigated all of the men's backgrounds to a greater or lesser degree. So here's a snapshot just from one of the pages. It gives a lot of the information we've already seen on an earlier slide, but where I felt the story is worth exploring, I've highlighted that and asterisked the name. So for George Atto Wright, we have more online for him, and Herbert John Clark Way, the bottom name, we've got even more for him should I wish and want to go back and research him further. Let's start by looking at the data that we've got. Some data won't surprise you, but certain things will jump out at you. Why so many? Why so few? Why for a host of different reasons? We'll come back to some of these figures later in the case studies. Looking at shared surnames, and there weren't many, none of the 228 men were actually related to each other, but obviously several did lose brothers in the war. Joseph Fisher, one of our men from Honingham, died in Gaza on the 19th of April, 1917. His brother Edgar died the same day. Birthplace. Naturally, we would expect the vast majority to be from Norfolk, but there was some mobility, resulting in just 18, the final bar on the graph, having their wills proved in Norwich, but not having been born in the county. And of those, one was from India, one from the USA, one from Canada, and one from New Zealand. With a few exceptions, these are all very young men. 5 of them still teenagers. 51 in the 20 to 24 age group, 85 in the 25-29 group, 53 in the 30 to 34 group, 24 in the 35 to 39 group, 7 in the 40 to 44 group, and 3 in the 45 to 50 group. Now, we know their rank at the time of writing their wills, and for some, their service numbers. I have amalgamated some of the ranks equivalent to each other, such as the ranks equivalent to private, gunners, drivers, pioneers, sappers, and troopers. 64% of our 228 are privates. I find this rather surprising, given that the lowest ranks would generally have the least to leave, especially when you combine this with the age profile we looked at before. We can also see here that almost all were serving in the army. The period between a soldier making his will, his death, and the will being proved at the Norwich Probate Court varied from months to years. Therefore, it was inevitable that by this time, some of our soldiers were either of a different rank, battalion, or regiment. We can see there's some of the promotions and the regiments. 31 were in a different regiment when they died to the one when they made their will. There are so many different regiments, far too many to name. And within that, the different battalions, the companies, the brigades. You would expect our Norfolk men to be serving with Norfolk regiments, but just 30% were. While most men stayed with the same regiment, they would sometimes end up in a different battalion. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission has over 2,500 designated World War I cemeteries and numerous memorials. There are also solitary headstones in various cemeteries. Our 228 men are commemorated in one of 110 cemeteries or memorials, on one of 18 memorials, some buried or remembered locally, such as Woodton, a village not too far from here, and Earlham in the middle of the city. Some memorials do not belong to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, such as the Portsmouth Naval Memorial and the Chatham Naval Memorial. Of the 146 with an actual grave, some here in Norfolk, just 69 have an inscription. Many are simple and often biblical. A few, like the one for Edgar at the bottom, short and to the point. He did his bit. So what happened to the women they loved who were left behind? We know of the surplus of women after the war, women who remained spinsters all their lives. 144 named no wife or sweetheart. 24 named their sweethearts, but some were impossible to trace as they only give the first name. I leave my darling Ethel, and you have no idea of wondering who Ethel is, sadly. 60 were married, and here we see where they were in 1921. So of the sweethearts, sadly one had died. 5 cannot be traced, 9 single, 9 married. The 1921 census of the wives, 2 unable to trace so far, 44 still widows, and 14 were married. This graph is as accurate as it can be at this stage, because without further research, we do not know the cause of death for 70 of our soldiers. Those reported as missing were later reported as killed in action on the day they went missing. Those remembered on memorials, their bodies never having been found, also fall into this category. So killed in action here, died of wounds, 70 unknown, accidents, appendicitis, disease, and I'm sure the numbers would have been higher than that, gas, the same, influenza. Clearly, we're also covering the period of the flu pandemic towards the end of the war and beyond. Insanity, pneumonia, and suicide. So we're going to start looking now at case studies, and all the men that I talk about, all of their wills are on the table behind you, should you wish to look at them later. So as we start to look at them, we form our own opinions about these men, accurate or otherwise, what happened to them, and their own personal stories. The last graph we looked at showed the cause of death, showed one was from suicide and one was from insanity. These were 2 of the 3 oldest men out of the 228. The oldest men, Henry Mason, he died of insanity. William Stevenson, he committed suicide. And Harry Wilkinson, cause of his death, but currently unknown. So let's look at Henry, known as Harry John Mason. At first glance, Harry Mason's will is very simple and straightforward, but his story is not. In the event of my death, I give the whole of my property and effects to my wife, Mrs. S.A. Mason, and who lives at East Dereham, Elsing, East Dereham in Norfolk. Very simple, very straightforward. Harry had been a military provost for 21 years until 1910. This was taken into account when he enlisted in Norwich on the 8th of September 1914. He was promoted to Company Sergeant Major 4 days later. The following August, he was promoted to Regimental Sergeant Major and he was sent to France for a few months. While there, he made his will. It is one of the latest wills to be proved in Norwich, taking 4 years, despite the fact that he actually died here in the city. He lived in Elsing with his wife Sarah, and they had 4 children. Harry was sent to India on the 27th of March 1916, and he was based at Dooley military camp there. Unlike any of the other 227 men researched so far, he took his family with him. Dooley was a large transport camp connected to the port of Mumbai. It held prisoners of war, and it also had a military hospital. It was renowned for soldiers having to wait a long time to be shipped home. Disease at Dooley was rife, as was syphilis, with many soldiers spending their time in local brothels. Syphilis can lead to a condition called GPI, general paresis of the insane. The prevalence of insanity at Dooley led to the term going doolally, which we still use today. Harry was admitted to the 34th Welsh General Hospital in June 1917 with GPI. It's unlikely, I think, he contracted it at Dooley, as symptoms can take some years after infection to develop. It was possibly linked to his younger days as a military provost and before he married Sarah in 1902. He was deemed unfit for military service and he was transferred to the Netley Hospital in Southampton. He came over in September 1917 and the same month was transferred to the Merthley Military Psychiatric Hospital in Perth. He was discharged from the military in October 1917. His condition, as we see on his medical report here, as not the result of, but aggravated by military service. He came back to Norfolk to the asylum in Helsden, and that's where he died on the 3rd of July 1918, 3 years after making his will. He's buried in Elsing. We can see his pension claim at the bottom refers to his previous service as a military provost. I have lost my screen. Looks like we are. Are we back? We're back, I think. Pick your notes up.
Claire, are we back?
Gives you plenty of time to read the slide.
Sorry about that. Yes,
We are back. Okay, so Sarah stayed on with the children, and on the 9th of June 1920, she married Eric George Hobra Davis, who was the garrison sergeant major. It was strange again that a year later, on the 1921 census, Eric declared that he was single, not married. And sadly, he died of heart failure at Dooley 3 years later. But by 1921, Sarah had come back to Norfolk with her 4 children. William is the second oldest man of our 228. He was 49 when he died. His campaign medal record tells us he committed suicide while at sea on the 8th of September 1918, just weeks before the armistice. Why was he at sea? His will was written in Bath in 1917. He was already 48, well beyond the conscription age of 41. A single man, he lived with his stepsister at the Three Boars Inn at Spooner Row, and he left everything to her. He was a private in the Army Service Corps in Dar es Salaam, the chief sea base for movement of supplies and the evacuation of wounded, and he is buried in Dar es Salaam. And then we come to the youngest. 5 boys, the youngest only 18. Leslie George Deuce, 19, Walter Edward Gibbs, 19, George Gutteridge, 19, Maya Joseph Levine, 18, Frederick George Webster, 19. They were all Norfolk boys, one from Norwich, 4 privates in the army, one a second lieutenant in the RAF. None had wives, understandably, but none had sweethearts either. None in the Norfolk Regiment. One is buried at Earlham Cemetery here, the rest are overseas. 1 died in an accident, 2 killed in action, and 2 cause of death unknown. I wonder if you can work out which one died in an accident. Was it one of the army soldiers or was it the RAF? Let's look at 2 of our teenagers whose wills are very different to each other. Here's Walter Edward Gibbs, the simplest type of will, leaving everything to his mother at Church Farm, Guestwick. Walter served as a private in the 9th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. He made his will on the 10th of January 1918 and died just 2 months later on the 27th of March. He was part of Operation Michael, the German-launched spring offensive along the Western Front. Walter is remembered on the Pozières Memorial in France, which commemorates over 14,000 casualties who died on the Somme between the 21st of March and the 7th of August, 1918. And then we have Second Lieutenant Maya Joseph Levine, the youngest of the 228. Born in Norwich, 10th of September 1899. His parents, Louis and Barbara Levine, by the time of his death, were living in Cromer. He had 8 siblings, one of whom, his brother Cyril, also died in service, and he's buried in Norwich Earlham Cemetery. He died in 1917 at the age of 20. He was served with the Machine Gun Corps. Now, I've made this will deliberately small because even enlarged, you don't have any chance of reading it. But there are copies, as I said, at the back. It's a very sharp contrast to the very simple will of Walter Gibbs. He made some very interesting bequests and made sure no one in the family was left out. So medals to mother, gold watch, chain, various gifts to his different siblings. And the rest of his estate went to his father once he'd made specific bequests. On his 18th birthday, the 10th of September, Maya joined the Royal Flying Corps. Maya enlisted in the Royal Flying Corps on his 18th birthday and was assigned to the 53rd Training Squadron based at Stamford, Lincolnshire. He died on the 8th of May 1918 when the RE-8 aircraft he was flying collided in mid-air over Stamford. Both aircraft spun out of control to the ground, killing both trainee pilots and a flying instructor. The Court of Inquiry decided that the cause of the accident was due, whilst the pilots were on duty, to inexperience on the part of Second Lieutenant Levine, in that he failed to turn his machine to the right when the leader, Lieutenant Thorne, the pilot of the other aeroplane, did so, and that Lieutenant Thorne had probably lost distance from the formation in carrying out two successive banks, thereby causing the two machines to collide. Five men died by accidents, and they were all caused by aircraft. This is sadly unsurprising, given that these were the early days of aerial warfare and the urgent need to test and fly aeroplanes. We've already seen what happened to Meyer Levine, the youngest of all our men, who is buried in Earlham Cemetery alongside his brother. So we have Captain Richard Henry Driffield, killed testing a new aeroplane at Mousehold. Moving on to number 3, Sergeant William John Pegg, who was in the army, killed by an aeroplane. Second Lieutenant William John Vince, killed in a mid-air collision. And Second Lieutenant William Dixon Wicks, whose aeroplane crashed as he approached landing in France. Then the standout name here for me is William Pegg, because he was in the army and had nothing at all to do with aeroplanes. William's will is quite lengthy, and we can see he had quite a lot to leave. I've highlighted various parts of his estate, but basically everything was left to his mother. He was born in Hackford, and the family then moved to Cromer. He enlisted in December 1914, and he was a sergeant in the Army Pay Corps, and later a second lieutenant in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He made his will on the 20th of February 1918. William was wounded at Le Basset in France on the 20th of September 1918, and he came back to England to convalesce at Caythorpe Court Convalescent Hospital in Kesteven, Lincolnshire. The hospital was next to the North Rorsby airfield, which we know as RAF Cranwell today. I think his parents must have been mightily relieved that he was safely back home from the front and recovering from his wounds. On the 18th of March 1919, while still convalescing, William and a fellow officer, Robin Dunn, went out in a pony and trap to follow a hunt taking place. As they approached North Rorsby, they were hit by the wheels of a swooping aeroplane and killed instantly. The aeroplane flew off, and the pilot was unaware of the incident until he landed and was informed. William is buried in Overstrand Churchyard. There were lots of press articles about this very unusual and tragic accident. Our 228 men are commemorated in over 128 places. The spreadsheet allows us to look at those commemorated in the same place, and if we tie this up with dates of death, we can identify groups of men who may have come from different backgrounds, regiments, etc., but shared common experiences in the last moments of their lives. The top 4 cemeteries you see here and memorials commemorate 49 of our 228 men, and the place names are likely to be very familiar to you. All of the rest are small numbers spread across many cemeteries and memorials. We're going to look at just one in particular, Cambrai Memorial. Cambrai Memorial in Louvain, France. 5 men from different regiments are remembered on this memorial. It commemorates more than 7,000 servicemen who died in the Battle of Cambrai in November-December 1917. Private William Brown, Private Reginald Wood Moulton, Second Lieutenant William Harry Parish, Private Sidney Payne, Private Frederick William Quantrill. The Battle of Cambrai started on the 20th of November, with the objective being to gain an advantage on the enemy, because the enemy were not expecting them to come across with tanks. The initial advances were very successful, but on the 22nd of November, a halt was called to give the troops time to rest and regroup. The trouble was, it also gave the Germans time to reinforce and prepare. So there then followed hard fighting, and much of the ground gained in the early days was soon lost. Let's look at two of the men. Reginald served in the Suffolk Regiment, no wife or sweetheart, a simple will, leaving his watch and cigarette case to his brother and the rest to his father. His will made a year before he died. Sidney was married to Mabel, Sidney Payne. They lived in Feltwell and had no children. He served with the Royal Inniskill Fusiliers. He made two wills. The top will you can see is Will A, up here. For the benefit of my wife, Mabel, as long as she remain my widow, and should she marry again, the whole of my property to be equally divided between, and then he names his siblings. So that will was made on the 26th of July. His estate was worth around 16,500 in today's money. So Mabel was going to get everything as long as she remained a widow. Just 2 months later, he made Will B, which you can see at the bottom. And in Will B, he leaves everything to Mabel and no mention of his siblings whatsoever. I wonder what caused his change of heart. But anyway, in 1921, Mabel was still living at the same address and she was still a widow. Some wills we can't ignore because they tell such interesting stories, sometimes because we can find out more about them. These men would generally come from higher rank or wealthier backgrounds. Some because they're just different to the majority of our 228. For example, those serving in the Royal Navy, those who were prisoners of war, or some unique circumstances in which they died. Only 6 of our 228 served in the Navy. Mac came from the wealthy Paston family at Paston Hall in North Walsham. This is reflected in his will. He left £100 to his old nurse, the equivalent of £7,500 today. He was a professional Navy man, passing out as an officer at Dartmouth in 1900. From April 14 to the end of 1916, he was the commander of HMS Lucifer and was involved in engagements off Heligoland Bight and Dogger Bank. He was mentioned in dispatches in June 1917. His naval record described him as keen, zealous, capable, a good disciplinarian, takes great pride in his ship. In November 1917, he was given the command of the brand new destroyer HMS Tornado. It was part of the Harwich force protecting merchant shipping off the coast of Holland. On the 23rd of December, the Harwich force was close to the Mass Light Buoy, waiting for a convoy to arrive. Unbeknown to them, the Germans had recently heavily mined the area, and they sailed into this minefield. HMS Torrent, part of the force, was hit first and started sinking. HMS Surprise went to help, suffered the same fate. Mac's ship Tornado tried to free itself from the minefield, but in doing so struck 2 mines and sank immediately with only 1 survivor. A 4th destroyer, HMS Radiant, avoided the carnage and returned home with the few survivors left. Mac's remembered on the Plymouth Naval Memorial, on a memorial window at St Margaret's Church in Paston, and on Northwold Memorial. Mac bequeathed money to his brother Claude, who had served in the Boer War, and sadly Claude died just a few years later. 5 of our men were prisoners of war. So let's look at 2 of them in more detail. So we have Sergeant Thomas Bracy Appleton, Private Claude Borrett, Rifleman Albert Lawrence Fordham, Private John Charles Gathercole, Private Robert Samuel Spall. So if we look at Claude Borrett, Claude was from Canada. He was educated in Norwich and he lived in Great Yarmouth. And there he married Nellie Ralphs in 1916. On the 22nd of March 1918, during Operation Michael, the German spring offensive, he was shot in the abdomen at Guise and taken prisoner. He died 3 days later and is buried at Guise La Désolation French National Cemetery, a cemetery that was used by the Germans. His wife Nellie never remarried, and his will took nearly 3 years to prove. Robert Samuel Spall was from Saxlingham. I love the opening comment in his will. This is in case I am not permitted to come home safe. On the 19th of November 1916, he was reported missing. On the 31st of December, he was reported as a prisoner of war. He was at Minden in Germany, where he died on the 6th of May 1917 of pulmonary phthisis. This is an extract from his death certificate. He's buried at Franzisen Cemetery, Minderheide, and his sweetheart, Clara Roberts, never married. Very few possessions. A wristwatch, pocketbook, tobacco pouch, very specific. Then we have Second Lieutenant Douglas Arthur Lehman. You can look at the spreadsheet and these men's stories in many different ways. The dates they died, the battles they fought, people they left behind, their personal stories. It was their last opportunity in their wills to convey their feelings about those they've had to leave behind. So we will finish with looking at 3 such wills. Firstly, this one of Douglas Arthur Lehman's. He was born in Neatsted, educated at Beccles College. Family went to Canada, worked for a firm of land agents in Winnipeg where he enlisted, and he was a corporal in the Canadian Infantry. He then became a second lieutenant in the Norfolk Regiment. On the 14th of August 1917, he was wounded by a gas shell at a railway dugout at Zillebeke, and he died in the ambulance on the way to the casualty clearing station, and he's buried at Lissenhoek Cemetery in Belgium. Douglas's will is quite straightforward. It was written on the 20th of January 1917. He died 7 months later. He leaves everything to his father, Philip Augustus Lehman, who was living in Canada. Here we can see all that Douglas had written. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to be able to read it. What it shows, though, is his actual will, Part A, which is up here. And then the second part of the will, Part B, is not actually a will, it's a letter written to his brother-in-law Ernest the very next day, which then continues onto the second page. It's the only will like this, and clearly the Norwich Probate Court put both documents together when they proved the will. So let's take a look at the actual letter. The letter is addressed to Ernest, who was married to Douglas's sister Dorothy. They lived in Great Yarmouth. The opening lines of the letter make it clear he'd intended to send Ernest and Dolly his will, but he'd forgotten. Thank you. I have written Dolly and yourself today, but I have forgotten to enclose my will. There's no punctuation in this letter, so if I pause at the wrong place, do take account. But I have forgotten to enclose my will. I have made my will and I've appointed you as my executor. You don't mind, do you? I've left everything to father because he wants it more than anyone. The whole thing. He wants it more than anyone and it won't amount to much. And he goes on to mention his employer, Ferrier, in Canada, that the money from there that will be owing is also to go to his father. And he continues his letter here. I have no more news, old chap, and as I have told you, all my news in my last letter. So everything goes to his father because he's very concerned about his father's welfare should anything happen to him. But it is one of the letters that the Norwich Probate Court did take into account when proving the will. Then we have Captain Geoffrey Barham Johnson. Born in Lullington, Somerset, but his father was a vicar. So basically he grew up in Norfolk at Ash Hill near Swaffham. He was educated at St George's Choir School at Windsor, and he received a coronation medal for singing in the choir at the coronation in 1902. He was educated at Gresham School, Holt, and he studied theology at Jesus College, Cambridge. So he came from a very different background to a lot of our men. His plan was to follow in his father's footsteps and become ordained. His studies were interrupted by the war, but he was awarded his degree anyway on account of his military service. At Jesus College, he was a keen rower. This photo is a snapshot of his student life, and I have to say my student life never looked quite like that table did. And Johnson is there in the striped blazer, standing at the back of the table. Geoffrey enlisted in 1914, and he started out by training recruits. He was promoted to the captain of 7th Battalion Norfolk Regiment. He made his will on the 29th of May 1915, just before going out to the front in June. In September, he came home on leave, and his sister reflected that he did not expect to survive the war and was actually coming home to say goodbye. On the 22nd of November 1915, Geoffrey was shot in the spine when handing over to the Royal Berkshires, and he died soon after that. His death is recorded as either the 22nd or 23rd of November, because he was shot late on the 22nd, but his death may have occurred in the early hours of the next day. He's buried in Vermelles British Cemetery in France. In his will, he left his estate to be divided equally between his brother John and his sister Catherine. Now, we haven't really looked at witnesses during this talk, but this is another avenue of potential. In Geoffrey's cases, his witnesses were in the same battalion as him. John Kenelm Digby was a second lieutenant from Highfield in Fakenham, and Lionel Clements Borthwick, a second lieutenant from Stuston Rectory in Skull. John died before Geoffrey did. His witness died before he did, on the 4th of August 1915. He was 24 and is buried in Rifle House Cemetery in Belgium. Lionel, fortunately, survived the war. In 1921, he was a lieutenant in the East Yorkshire Regiment. In 1939, he was a civil servant for the Air Ministry, and he died in Suffolk in 1964. And then we have Ralph William Thurger. He was a keen sportsman, born in Brundall on the 28th of September 1890, educated at the Norwich Grammar School. His father was an auctioneer and he worked for him. Very keen sportsman. He played cricket for Norfolk and he was on Norwich City's books as a goalkeeper. We can see that he rose through the ranks, private, second lieutenant, and then captain. He enlisted on the 14th of October 1914, shortly after war broke out. Now, his full military record cannot be traced. He served in the 4th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment. We do know he spent a few days in hospital in London in 1915, suffering from a gunshot wound to the shoulder. In 1917, he was part of the Eastern Expeditionary Force. The first Battle of Gaza lasted 3 days. The first Battle of Gaza, in March that year had failed. The second Battle of Gaza lasted 3 days, from the 17th to the 19th of April. Again, the Eastern Expeditionary Force failed to take Gaza from the Turks, and Ralph was one of the many casualties who died on that final day of the second battle. For his actions on the field, he was awarded the Military Cross, and here you can see on the screen the report from the London Gazette about his bravery on the field. He's buried in Gaza War Cemetery. We finish with Ralph's will. His two witnesses were Lieutenant Thomas Norman Flatt and Lieutenant George Kenneth Hampton, both in his battalion. Thomas survived the war. He spent some time in the RAF, but returned to the army in 1920. He married and emigrated to Canada. George died in Turkey in August 1915, just weeks after he witnessed Ralph's will. Ralph made some interesting bequests and some lovely personal comments to explain them. £1,250 to his very great friend Frank W. Hale is worth around £74,500 in today's money. His friend Frank was just 4 years younger than Ralph, a friend perhaps made through sport. There's no military record so far found for him. I like the final bequest, his motorcycle and sidecar and accessories to Mr. John Haley, because obviously he was billeted with them in April 1915. It helps build up a bigger picture of his military life. So where do you go next? You might be related to one of these men. Do look at the spreadsheet. There are 228 men on there in alphabetical order if you're interested in a particular person. They may come from where you live, your village, your town. You might be interested in the battles or the regiments. So just use the research that I and others have done, and many thousands more besides will hopefully not be forgotten. Thank you.